Good evening, everyone. My name is Deb Turcott. I'm the principal at ORIANA Solutions, and I am the host of the Women Not Working webinar series. Really excited to be able to talk with Katelyn Jerles tonight about demystifying recruiters and search firms. I want to go over a couple of things just to remind you of what's coming up next week. So on Wednesday, February 10th at 7 p.m. Eastern, we will have Melissa Pratt, who will be with us to speak completely about personal style and confidence. She's really wanting to help women understand that when we feel good about ourselves, when we connect to our own style, that we can feel more confident in presenting ourselves in an interview format or virtually or in person for that matter. And so she's actually going to have a couple of special guests with her. Makeup artist will be one of them. And then she's also going to bring Saks Fifth Avenue on to talk a little bit about fashion and current trends in the workplace, as well as how do you put your best foot or face, I guess, for that matter, forward on a virtual interview. So look for that. And then, of course, at the end of the series, I'll be closing out the series with a session all about leadership called Living as a Leader and Loving It, where we'll talk about leadership at every level. We'll debunk some of the common misconceptions about leadership, but we'll also talk about the ways that you can hone your skills, what's expected and the current trends in the workplace, and how you can really connect to yourself as a leader, whether you have a title or not. So I look forward to that session. But tonight in particular, I'm looking forward to this session with Katelyn Jerles. I got to know Katelyn when we were both working at the University of Florida. It was a great gift to get to partner with her when we were both helping veterinary students connect to their passion. She did that as a career counselor. Before that, she was a recruiter. And actually, since we've promoted this series, she's taken another job as a recruiter. So when we talk about getting information from the horse's mouth, you're going to get it from Katelyn tonight. So I'm looking forward to that. But Katelyn has this really amazing way of helping people better understand how to encapsulate themselves as a professional, put themselves forward in their job search. And now as a recruiter, she can also give you some of the tips and the super secret squirrel things from behind the curtain, so to speak, about how to work with recruiters. So it's going to be a great session, and I know that you're going to connect with her. She also has an additional resource that we'll provide by emailing to you. And then she also has it on her own company website. She and another woman own a career productions company where they help professionals put their best foot forward in their professional career, as well as whether they're interviewing or their LinkedIn profile. And so it's really been exciting to work with another small business owner and partner in this webinar series. So with that, I just want to say welcome to Katelyn. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Deb. I really appreciate you having me on. I'm excited for what we're going to talk about.
Me too. I think it's, I was just talking with a client today who's been working with a lot of different recruiters, and there's so many things that are challenging in that journey, and it's easy to make some missteps. So we're really excited that you're going to share information with our viewers tonight. So why don't we just start real quickly, if you don't mind, maybe tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what caused you to say yes when I reached out and said, hey, Katelyn, will you join us in this webinar series?
Yeah, so when I saw your name, I knew it was going to be gold. So I knew I was going to say yes right away. But what made me reaffirm that decision to say yes is really this mission of working with women and empowering women who may have been displaced due to the current situation, and allowing them to use this and reframe it as a way to take a step forward. Maybe this is a good time to look at everything that's going on, re-envision what you want your career and your life to look like, and then take those strategic steps forward. So that's why I'm excited to be here tonight. My background, kind of like what you touched on, so I am actually trained as a counselor, and I also met Kim Richmond, who was in one of your earlier sessions, working back at the University of Florida, and I jokingly say I chose career counseling for my own mental health because I do not dabble in mental health counseling, but I'm trained to do that. So I look at everything from a counseling perspective. Like you said before, I used to work in recruiting and HR for nonprofits back in North Carolina. And then I was in career coaching, both in my profession and with my business, with my partner, Sarah. And then now I'm back in recruiting as of a few weeks ago. So an exciting change, but great material for this session, which I'm excited to share.
Well, first of all, congratulations. Very excited for you. And I know that this new company is very lucky to have you. And I think the veterinary community continues to be lucky to have you as a partner in connecting veterinarians to meaningful work for themselves. So congratulations. I think that's very exciting.
Thank you.
So why don't we start by talking about what is a recruiter? I mean, you and I have joked many times about the challenges that many of our clients face, and but in all seriousness, it is a real challenge for some folks. And so can you talk a little bit about what a recruiter is, what their role is, who they work for, really the mechanics of their role in the work that they're doing?
Yeah, so recruiter is such a broad term, but it means so many different things, and it can mean a lot of different motives and just approaches to work. So I usually say with recruiters, it's very malleable. You can build your own sandbox. So that sandcastle can look like whatever the heck you want it to look like. So asking questions of your recruiter is so important. The main difference we'll see is recruiters that are termed in-house. So recruiters that work for the organization that they're hiring for, they are an employee, they're on the payroll. Their goal is to place people at that organization. So we'll see those types of recruiters. And then we'll see recruiters that place people at places different from their employer, or they might even be a contractor or run their own business, and they are focused at placing people at different places, different organizations, use a different word there. And so those are the main differences that we'll see. And we can talk a little bit more about what that means for those differences, if that's helpful.
I think so. I think, I see it regularly with individuals who are in their job search and we'll talk a little more about LinkedIn later, but especially through LinkedIn, a recruiter reaches out because you've said you're open to work. But then you find out, well, the recruiter doesn't actually work for that company. So how does this work? So I think if you could maybe tell people, let women know, how do you know the difference? How can you spot the difference between an in-house recruiter versus a contract one? And how can you spot a difference between recruiters that are, in essence, drumming up their own business as opposed to having been contracted formally by a company?
Yes, so those are very good differences. So ways to tell who a recruiter works for, you can always ask them. I mean, you hope that they'll tell you the truth. That would be great if they told you the truth. But even before you ask them, you can look on their LinkedIn profile, do a little research, Google their company, who it says they work for, their employer, Google them if they have a name that's not extremely generic. That can be helpful. And it's also good to know, are they a recruiter for, let's say, accountants, or are they just a recruiter that's trying to find anybody to place anywhere? Usually the more specialized you can get, they know the industry better, they're a little bit more in depth in their role. But that's going to be the main thing. So looking at LinkedIn, doing a little Google search, not, finding out what they had at their high school reunion, but really just trying to see where they work from, where they come from. You can always ask them too. And then the difference between a contracted recruiter, so this is a recruiter that has either an agreement with a company that they're placing you at. So maybe this company is a little smaller, a little newer, testing out this recruiter. And so they have an agreement set in place with this person, and this person goes and finds people, they present them to the company, and the company gets to interview them and decide if they would like to move forward. For an employee, for a recruiter that's not contracted, they're just out there grab bagging, finding people, and then so I got an email today actually that said, hey, I have this wonderful veterinarian who wants to work part-time. She is amazing. She's the best veterinarian you've ever seen. Do you want to be in contact with her? And so this is a recruiter that we haven't talked to before. We haven't asked to find somebody for this position. They're just finding people and then finding employers and trying to match them together. Those are a little bit on the shadier side because you don't know what's behind the curtain. He could be doing this to all the other practices in the area and all the other employers, and we have no idea.
I think that's really helpful advice for everyone. So it sounds like, to boil it down a little bit, it's fine to work with all of the different types of recruiters as long as you're really clear about who they work for, what that relationship looks like. But on the contract side, or I shouldn't say the contract side, but let's say the pavement pounding side, right, where they aren't actually contracted, how does someone know, how does a candidate know who pays for the placement? So are there particular types of questions that you would recommend candidates ask recruiters to better understand whether they're contract or pounding pavement? You know, who's paying for your work? How is that going to work? Just so people feel really comfortable about that.
Yeah, so I think it's perfectly fine to say, you know, how are you compensated for this? What's your, you know, not how much is it, but what's that process look like? As a job seeker, I would run to the hills for any recruiter that asks you for money. You should never be paying any money. And there's some scammers out there that will ask you for, hey, if you pay this up front, I'm going to present you to all these different companies. You'll look amazing. You'll get your dream job. Those are, no, don't do. I would highly suggest against that. But asking, you know, like, what's your compensation structure? You can ask that. Slim chances that they're going to change anything by you asking that. So they're not going to, you know, restructure how they're paid. But typically the ways that we'll see them get paid. So if they're contracted out, they might already have a payment. And so they're just paid to present a certain number of candidates a month or a certain number of, you know, leads for this company to interview, or they can be paid based on your compensation package. So that's when you're working with recruiters, it can really vary. So if I'm an in-house recruiter, when I'm talking to you, I'm better off if you make less money, because then our company overhead is lower, my P&Ls are lower. So as an in-house recruiter, know that you're going to be negotiating not in conflict, but just with different interests than I have. For an outside recruiter, they're going to be, if they're getting paid based off of your salary or your take home for that first year, they want you to have as high as possible. So they're really going to be egging you on, negotiating, saying that you want these high numbers. So just knowing that in mind can be helpful, so you know how to preface those conversations.
I think that's such great advice, because I think this is a place where a lot of candidates trip up a little bit in the journey with recruiters, is better understanding what lens the recruiter has for their partnership or not in the negotiating process. And so that's a great segue into my next question for you, which is, what are the typical questions that a recruiter is going to ask you, maybe independent of what type of recruiter they are, but what kind of questions are they going to ask? And then maybe if you could follow on and just let us know, what should a candidate not divulge, or where is it okay to hold things pretty close to the vest?
Yeah, so I would say some recruiters might come to you and say, you know, if you ask, who are you working for? The template answer is, I'm working for you. I'm helping you get where you want to go. So, right. So, okay, that's cool, but who's paying you is what you would ask next. But when they say that, know that everything that you're relating to them is an interview. It's included in the hiring conversation. And what you're communicating to the recruiter is going to be communicated down the chain. So there's a telephone that's happening here. And whatever you say could be misconstrued. So being extremely clear in your communication is necessary, because if you say something or you're a little wishy-washy in something, that could be, so for example, I had a candidate today who was just asking about start dates. And so saying, you know, I don't know if I want to start this month. Can we push it back a little bit more? I might say, oh, this candidate wasn't really excited about the position, which in your mind, you might have had a family vacation or something happening that month. And so you were still super excited about the position, but you just need to start a later month. And so if you don't tell me that, I'm going to think, oh, they weren't really into it. So maybe let's not push as hard for this person. So being extremely clear and knowing, being able to share that, because it's going to be shared down the line. That's my job, is to communicate to other people what you're interested in and where you might be a good fit.
To be clear for everybody, you're an in-house recruiter. So when you talk about your perspective right now, that's what you're referencing, not a contract recruitment position.
No, yes. Yes, good call out, Deb. And then as far as things that we'll ask, so any type of recruiter is going to ask, your background, what you're looking for, what your skills are. Don't be humble. I don't know who you are, and you really need to be your biggest champion, because I need to understand how great you are, so that way you are put in positions or put up for positions that would be a great fit for you. They're almost always going to ask about what you expect to be paid and if you want to relocate. So having those answers prepared is going to be extremely helpful to be able to communicate that clearly, so you're not put off when the question comes up.
Yeah, I think, and to add on to that, so let's talk about the salary question, right? Because many times, especially an in-house recruiter, which goes back to your earlier statement about, that your interests are not always the same. Obviously, you both have the same goal, but how you get to that goal might look a little bit different. And so an in-house recruiter says to you, well, what's your current salary?
Yes.
Well, a lot of candidates will tell them what their current salary is instead of offering what their expected range is. So can you maybe give a little bit of guidance around particularly the salary questions that will be asked?
Yeah, so that's great. So the reason we put together this resource is so you can have templates and scripts for what to say when those questions pop up. And in a few states now, they've actually kind of put that off limits. So your past salary is off limits, not for a majority of the states. So this is still a question that they can ask. You can choose if you'd like to answer or not. And you can say, I understand that this position is going to have some more responsibilities and more roles. The salary that I'm expecting for this type of position is between this and this. So you can give a range. You can say, I know the average salary for these types of position is this, and I'm expecting that salary. You can even, if you feel like more comfortable, you could say, my current employer, wants to keep that private, but I'm looking for a salary here. I want to keep that private, but I want my salary here. If you give them a number that's an anchor for what you're making now, they're going to base it off that number. If you give them a range and expectation, then they can anchor it off of that.
I think that's great guidance. And what about relocation? So if a recruiter doesn't offer, I was working with someone today who's actually contemplating relocating probably about halfway across the country. And so far in the journey, the conversation hasn't come up about whether or not they're going to cover reload costs. And so can you talk a little bit about maybe how a candidate can pursue that conversation if it doesn't come up naturally from the recruiter's lens?
Yeah, so I'm not going to offer it unless you ask. So if I can skirt around it, that's just the basis. Ask for anything that you're thinking. Obviously, in the first phone screen, don't say, hey, so when are you going to pay to move me out to California? But really putting it out there and asking. If in the beginning, when they ask the relocation question, if you're not going to relocate, accept it. You're not the person that's a relocator. That's perfectly fine. But I don't want you to get through the whole process and get to the end and say, oh, maybe I don't want to do that. But if you're getting to that point, you can say, I'm willing to relocate for the right role. And that's going to have to reflect that increased salary or that relocation bonus or something. When you get further along in the hiring process, you have more leverage. They want you more. You're already a high candidate, so you can use some of that to your advantage.
I think that's really great advice. So sometimes there's a right time to bring something up, and it may not be early, it may be later in the process, because now you are really validated as a candidate in their journey. And so there's a balance though, right? So Like, when is being assertive too pushy? You know, we always encourage candidates to be confident, right? And to share, like you said, I don't know you. I don't know what you've got going on, or I can look at your LinkedIn and I can look at your resume, but that doesn't tell me the whole story about who you are. But where's that line? And maybe how do candidates know they've pushed some of the wrong buttons with a recruiter?
Yes. So there are many things that you can test out. And I would say, obviously, if you're doing video or if you're in person, body language is huge. So paying attention to that. A lot of people are really nervous in these types of situations. So I will ask some of our clients, how did the interview go? And they go, I don't know, I blacked out, or I don't remember it. So really before that, taking extra time to think of, okay, let me read their body language while I'm talking and really look at them and see what their reactions are. So that's huge. Secondly is communication. So, following appropriate guidelines and following up and really checking in. So asking questions to say, if you say, this is my expected salary, is that on par with what you're recruiting for this position? And you can get a gauge and they can say, actually, that is double what we were going to offer to somebody. So you have a good idea of that understanding and you're not just going to get ghosted and not know why. But anytime you feel some of that friction, if you feel comfortable digging a little deeper and asking about where that's coming from.
So you brought up ghosting, and I'm so glad you brought it up because I think this happens. I mean, it happens in life anyway, right? Like people, for goodness sakes, my young adult children ghost me on text messages sometimes, and it drives me crazy, but that's fine, right? We'll get over that. But when you're really looking for a role and you've had this recruiter that you feel like has really blown a lot of sunshine your way to get you into a process, and then all of a sudden they disappear, what guidance do you have? I mean, it's a thing, it's a real thing for people. So what guidance do you have for candidates that perhaps have been ghosted, or maybe what's the right cadence of follow-up? When do you give up? Like, when do you accept that this might not be working, but what are some of the tactics you can deploy in between?
Yes, that's a great, I get ghosted quite often from friends and family members, but it feels different when it's from a recruiter that's been your BFF for the last few weeks, updating you on everything and seeing how things go. So from my perspective, which is in-house recruiting, I'm really a fan of our morals in this role. So our morals always a candidate chooses. So instead of some other companies who might point you to like, this is a position that's been open the longest because it sucks, and we really want you to only interview for this role, this is your only option. We give you all the options. So we want you to be the happiest you can be with us. So we want you to give you all the options. That being said, another part of that moral is we also give preference for for candidates from inside our company. So let's say I've been talking with you, you interviewed somewhere, and then I have somebody from the clinic down the street that called me up and said, hey, Katelyn, we're relocating. My son's going to a different school district. We have to move over. So I'm going to give that in-house candidate preference. So the whole moral of that story is recruiters, I always equate us to ducks. So above the water, we're just like this, swimming along all happily, look all, and then underwater, we're feverishly kicking really hard and working and trying to communicate, figuring out who's over here, who's over there, how are we going to do all this? So the ghosting, some of it is unintentional, and it's just from communicating with multiple parties and trying to figure everything out and make sure all these lines fall, because people are messy, jobs are messy, and we're just trying to make sure that we can make everybody as happy as they can be as an in-house recruiter, right? But it can really happen the same way. So I'm really into metaphors, as you'll find out tonight, for maybe a contract recruiter or an outside recruiter. They have chess pieces and you're just one of their chess pieces. So they're trying to fit you, see where they can push you in or where can they get you. And they might have you in the same square for quite a while and just not be able to move you to where they think you should be next. So thinking of it that they're juggling a lot of balls. As a candidate, I would encourage you to go fishing with different recruiters, have a few lines in these different pools, figure out, which one's hitting, which one do you need to reel in a little bit more, but really looking at as the bigger picture. with ghosting, I mean, we have phones on us all the time. We have email pulled up all the time. They see your messages. They see you messaging them. It's not a question of, maybe if you send one email and it goes to spam, but most of the time that's not the case. Maybe their kid accidentally deleted your voicemail, but most of the time that's not the case. So really it's waiting on other people, waiting on news, and maybe they don't have news for you, or they've moved forward with other candidates in the process and they're not ready to tell you no yet, which is a reality. We want to keep our cards until we're ready to lay out our whole hand, and then we can tell you that, you know, we've moved on with somebody else for this role. So that's a lot.
Yeah, but I think that's great advice. And I love just how plainly you lay it out, because I do think that's a challenge. Like it is like this mystical being, the recruiter that's out there, and they're my friend until they're gone. And it's like heartbreaking for candidates. And you know, and I know a lot of recruiters, and people like you are amazing. And so I know there are really well-intentioned recruiters. I also know that there are some that are less well-intentioned. And then all along the mix, they're incredibly human. And so but I always say, you know, if you've tried twice, if you've pinged them twice with really polite, engaged emails, or you've emailed once and you've followed up with a phone call and left a voicemail, and you don't hear, I love your idea of go fishing with someone else. Like, see what other ponds are stocked for you, because not every role is going to work out. And I do think sometimes that the pace of a company is reflected in their recruiters. And so that may not be the best culture for you if it doesn't align with the way that you view how things should be handled. And I know that's a tough spot to put recruiters in, but it's true. I tell candidates regularly, if you don't enjoy the recruiter, don't keep going.
No,
don't keep going.
Yes. And we, as recruiters, we are emulating the company, right? In the face of the company. And I love what you said about, if one method of communication doesn't work, try another, because I may suck at email. I may get hundreds of emails a day, but if you call me, I can pick up the phone and say, hey, yeah, we're still waiting on, you know, this person to let us know what they think, and then we'll get back to you. But I love that idea of trying different methods of communication. Now, as a recruiter, I can see when you call me and don't leave a voicemail 10 times in the afternoon. So really, I think that's why we created this resource, right? Is so that you can understand what's within the parameters. Because when I see your number pop up for the 10th time, likewise, that's telling me that, you know, you're going to keep pushing and calling, and I don't have anything to tell you yet. So leave a voicemail or try email. And really acknowledging what you're doing, I think, is huge. And so when you leave the voicemail, say, you know, hey, this is Katelyn. I was calling to follow up on our conversation from last week. I'll go ahead and send you an email. If it's easier, just reply to that email and we can go from there. So that way you have a voicemail and you have an email, and I can pick which one I want to respond to you with. But again, all those templates and fun words and scripts are in that resource to look at.
Yeah, that's great. And I know people are going to be so happy to have that resource. And occasionally I will, if someone really, really wants the job, like this is their dream job, I will sometimes encourage them when they leave the voicemail or send the email to say, you know, understand that you're really busy, but if I don't hear something by next week, I'm going to reach out again, just to confirm where the process is. Sometimes that adds enough pressure to well, oh, I know I'm going to hear from, you know, Susie next week. So, and if it doesn't, then I think you have a really clear answer. And I think sometimes that's the hard part as a candidate too, is when do we accept that no news is not good news? Because usually no news is good news, but in this case, no news is not often good news.
Yes. And if you send me an email and say, I'll give you a call later today, you better bet that I'm going to reply to that email as soon as possible, so you don't have to call me later today, because I love email, not a phone call. So yes, giving that preference of your guidelines and what your planned follow-up is next. And then it doesn't look as unintentional as it might happen to be sometimes.
That's great. And so what about though, so a recruiter gets back to you and says, you know what, we're really sorry you didn't get the role. Like we picked another candidate, what have you. Like, can candidates ask for feedback, and what should they expect if they do ask for feedback? Will that be a valuable part of the journey for them?
Yeah, so I think feedback is always valuable, right? Because we can learn from it and grow from it and do better next time if we're given constructive feedback, right? Sometimes feedback is not that constructive. And unfortunately, in some HR, some recruiting roles, we'll fall back to this fit thing. And that's just kind of our catch-all net. So we'll say, hey, we really appreciate you asking for feedback. Unfortunately, it just wasn't a great fit, or we found the candidate that was a better fit for the role. And so that really doesn't tell you a whole lot. But if they can give you some details about maybe your experience level or, some skills that you can learn, that's helpful. But always ask for feedback. And in the feedback template we have, that shows that you're willing to grow and learn, but also it says, I'd love to hear about any other open positions with, maybe it's a company, maybe it's a recruiter firm. So that keeps you in their pool if you are still interested in working for them.
Oh, I think that's great, Katelyn. Thank you. And so one of the other places where I find that some of our clients have challenges is, they on LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn's great. It has this little open to work thing. You can put in your job preferences. Like there's all these great ways to use LinkedIn. And I know your resource covers quite a few of those. The concern that I have is when candidates do that and nobody reaches out. What are some of the most typical things that candidates can do with their LinkedIn profile to maybe improve? And we've had some other speakers talk about LinkedIn, but what, from your lens, what do you think they can do to improve so recruiters might notice them, or the pieces on their profile are connecting them with the right recruiters?
Yes, so I think that's a great point. There's some back-end preferences that you can do for your job search that'll help kind of show you up higher on my LinkedIn search list. So most recruiters have LinkedIn Premium, and you can get a free trial for about a month or so. So it's pretty neat to see. But when you're looking at positions that you're interested in, I almost want you to use it as a checklist. If you've done that, I want to see it on your profile somewhere. I want those words to show up. So whether that be in your skills, in your experience, in your summary. So that's how we get to making your profile awesome, right? And there's templates, resources for that out there. What really helps you stay on the radar is activity. So posting things, commenting on things, following companies, following their company. I love to see that. So if you've already followed our company, I know you're interested and you've done some research. So all that can be great and really help you show up higher on these profiles and more people will see you. Now, outside of LinkedIn, I'm going to be a broken record. I love informational interviews. And I think if you can get those and build champions for you and add them to your LinkedIn network, really use them to level up on your profile and create that algorithm so you show up higher to recruiters when we're searching for candidates.
Yeah. And so how important are the recommendations, right? So on the LinkedIn profile, right, there's an about place, which we just had Ellen talk to everyone about putting your branding statement in there. And obviously you have your experience and you can feature things, and you've talked about activity, and skills are obviously a great way to match yourself to job profiles. But what about the recommendations? Do you, as a recruiter, do you see that as valuable? Is that where does that rank, I guess, for you when you're evaluating a candidate?
Meh. It's great. It's great if you have them. It's really nice. But I know, I've gotten so many like, hey, Katelyn, can you write me a recommendation? Can you write this? And it's good, but I'm going to, when you're at a different level or when you're at the final level of the interview, I'm going to call your references and get more information there. So helpful. Some people get really into the ratio of how many you've given versus how many you've received, but some industries just aren't on LinkedIn. Some people, haven't sent out all those requests for recommendations. So it's very nice. Would I turn you away because you had none? No. Okay. I'm kind of open there, but.
Well, I think that's helpful because sometimes people don't have a ton of time to invest. Yeah. And so helping them understand the most impactful places to invest on their LinkedIn profile, it sounds like that will certainly not hurt you to have those recommendations, But if you're going to invest in what the keywords are in your areas of experience, the skills that you have, being really clear about your job preferences, and then be active, like you said, so that, if you're applying for a retail role and you only, like, I don't know, the healthcare groups, like probably not going to connect you with the set of recruiters that you're wanting to be part of. So I think that's really helpful advice for folks. And then maybe if we could, can we switch gears just a little bit? And they're not necessarily different, but I think it goes back to the different types of recruiters. So we have in-house recruiters, we have contract recruiters, we have the pound the pavement version, which is sort of my new name for them. But then there's also search firms. So there's really these companies that, especially at the executive level or the higher levels, they're entire companies that just go out and get the opportunity. We see it a lot in nonprofit, healthcare, academia, where they're actually searching for these individuals and they're hired on to do that. Is there anything different about working with them versus the guidance you've already given about the other types of recruiters?
Yeah, so I do think they're different in that they are sourcing more. So they're looking at more of those passive all-stars. Typically, when we're in the job search, we're either bored and ready for that next level, want to pivot in our career, or really don't like our job. So it's not everybody that would be a great candidate for this role. So usually these executive search firms have experience, have a network within that organization or that industry, and they are going to hit people who are doing amazing jobs, love their company, and kind of, hey, you're doing so great, we want to see how you would do here. So it can be a little bit more flattering, but also more intensive of a process, and it definitely more competitive because they are doing that active sourcing in the beginning. But most of the other stuff, figuring out, what their motivations are, knowing that they're actively doing this for multiple people, those stay pretty consistent.
Okay, I think that's very helpful, especially for those, there's a lot of healthcare jobs or jobs within the academic institutions. And I think it's really great just to know the distinctions, because if you're not accustomed to working with recruiters or search firms, all of a sudden it becomes this big mess, and it feels very much like they're your best friend. I love that you called them BFF earlier, because it's like, wow, this person's really in my camp and this feels so good and I have a shot. And then all of a sudden you're like, there's crickets. There's no one coming back to me. And it is daunting. And I think, maybe if there's an encouraging message, like what would you tell folks like about not giving up? I think your metaphor of the fishing in the pond, but is there any other sort of inspiring message you can give about how to work through this and not give up in the middle of it?
Yes, it is it's incredibly hard to not give up, right? The rejection, the failure, the grief that you work through when you don't get a position is something that is there. Sit in it, process it. It really sucks. Usually I have to take like 2 to 3 days before I send a feedback email, because I have to draft it and check myself and make sure that I'm coming across how I want to come across. But I think knowing that it's across the board, it's hardly ever personal. It's not, you did this and somebody else didn't do this. It's more so fit and looking at, would it be a good fit for the company? I usually think, if you didn't make it to that round, you probably wouldn't have enjoyed working in that organization. But you can always try again. There's super competitive pools right now, especially with everything that's going on. So the job market is that much harder, and you're going to get more rejections. I always tell people it's like dating and marriage. It only takes one, right? You don't need to find 3 people to marry. You just need to, you need to find one job, not 3 jobs at the same time.
I think that's a really great context. And, we didn't talk about this necessarily in advance, but I do think there's a couple other pieces that we could touch on for folks, because I've gotten some questions from women who are later in their career. And so, one of the things that I find is that unintentionally we age ourselves in interviews or in conversations, and then we feel like age is what held us back from getting a job. So a simple statement like, oh, I probably did this before you were born, which isn't intended to be anything but small talk, but it actually creates a dissonance between, people who have like skills or the skills that you have being front and center. So is there any guidance you could give women professionals who are later in their career about how to not create that dissonance between the experience that they have to offer and the sense that they're going to end up being excluded because of their age?
Yeah, so I really liked, it was from an earlier session, but talking about reframing that for yourself before you go into the interview or before you go into that conversation. And so if that's your belief system, if that's what you have running in the back of your mind, it's going to be very hard to hide that and to prevent that from coming out. I have no idea if this is appropriate or not, but we used to call it war stories. I don't know if you've heard this before, but where people would just continually talk and tell you stories and tell you how things were done. And it was very much a narrative instead of a two-way conversation. So that's something that we also see with some older candidates is really being able to have that two-way street. So having that in mind beforehand, but reframing it as you have all of this context that you're able to draw from and bring to the table. So you're able to showcase these different experiences. You have the background knowledge, and then showing that you're there to learn and you're there to teach at the same time. So really balancing those two, but again, just like the earlier session, really having that as your belief system is going to be limiting. So reframing that into how you could do that. I see it a lot with our moms who are staying at home and then coming back into the workforce, and they always want to say how that was detrimental, but let's reframe that into how that's a positive. How are you a better employee or better potential employee now because of that experience instead of in spite of that experience?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And, when we've talked about it in some of the other sessions as well, whereas if you've had a gap in employment and I know you reference it on this resource sheet for everyone, but, a gap is not a bad thing. It actually sometimes creates opportunities for you to do other things. I think about the session that Mercedes gave on some of the technology and skills that you can pick up if you're trying to make the most of this moment right now, but perhaps you did something else during this time that really advanced your understanding or gave you the opportunity to acquire new skills, or you joined a board or whatever it might be. But all of those things are value adds to who you are as a professional. And to echo something Ellen said in last week's session, where she really talked about your value proposition, right? You have your branding statement and you have your value proposition. And when you're really clear about that and you can come back to that, I think it keeps them from the war stories. I love it that you call it that. And I'm probably guilty of having done that before, but it comes with the territory, I think, sometimes. But I do think that if you can center on that value proposition, right, that's all positive. It's things you've contributed of value, and that it has nothing to do with age, right? It has everything to do with experience, skills, competency, and what difference you make for an organization. So I think that's great guidance on your part. Thank you.
Yes, and I would even say with that, really, if you can answer that question for me as a recruiter, then I don't have the question mark in the back of my head. So it's like, we both see it, we both see the gap. We know it's there. You can't really, there's people try to go about hiding things like that, but address it. Tell me how it benefited you. Tell me why it's good for me and for this role. So that way I can communicate that further down the line.
I agree. There's no story when you take the story away, yes. Right? So if you just address it right away, all of a sudden it's a non-issue, right? We've addressed it. And I've heard it many, many times when it had been a very positive thing. Someone says, well, there's a gap in her employment, and the recruiter or another interviewing manager, hiring manager will say, oh, but she said blah, 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 blah. And it was like matter of fact, moved on, got into their skill set and their value proposition. And it became nothing but a passing part of the conversation.
Yes, definitely.
So is there anything else? I mean, we're almost out of time. This has been really great. And I have loved your candor. So I just have to say thank you on behalf of all of these women that are going to watch this. But is there anything else you feel like people need to know? Like, what else is a must know? Is there anything we didn't cover that we really should for the benefit of women who might work with recruiters?
Yeah, so I hope my candor has been appropriate and welcomed. I try to be as real as I can because there's so much out there that's, hidden culture or different terminology used to exclude people. And I think that's silly. We need to have this open language so you understand what's on the table and that everybody's playing from the same table, right? But I think the main thing is that it's a silly Michael Jordan quote, which I'm a North Carolinian, so I'm all about Michael Jordan, but you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? So if you don't try, if you don't reach out, if you don't respond to that message on LinkedIn, some people are like, oh, that looks like spam. They don't know what they're doing. But just really putting yourself out there to be vulnerable and open and seeing what's out there. Sometimes we foreclose on opportunities before they're even an option. And so I want you to just encourage you to message a few recruiters, look them up, do it. The worst they say is nothing, which really isn't that bad at all. So that's really what I want to get across from tonight.
I think it's a great piece of advice to end with. And, it's funny, you love metaphors. I love metaphors too, but it reminds me of like buying a house. So someone's out buying a house, and the first house they look at, they're so excited, especially a first-time home buyer, and they're really excited about this house and they love it. It's like, let's talk to another house. Let's go see another house so that we have a chance to compare value to cost, as well as the things that we really, and so we create sort of this framework of knowledge and experience by talking to more than one recruiter or looking at more than one house if we carry the metaphor through. So I am so grateful that you did this. Your candor was absolutely appropriate. But I agree with you. When we create hidden messages or we hold things so close to the vest, and I don't know if you remember, but one of the sessions we did together at the University of Florida, I talked about in the art of negotiation, it's not about getting the upper hand, right? It's about coming to a place where you both feel like you've won. And so I think that's the best recruiters are the ones that'll frame it that way. And when candidates frame it that way too, it actually can become a seamless relationship. So your candor's been excellent. I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for doing this, Katelyn.
Oh, thank you for having me. I've really appreciated it. And I'm so excited for all that y'all are doing.
Thank you. And we'll share Katelyn's resource both on the ORIANAsolutions.net website and then at her Career Productions website. She'll also have a link there for women, but we're going to email it to all of the folks who have signed up for this particular session. And if you have any questions about any of the sessions or concerns, please feel free to email us at connect@ORIANAsolutions.net. Don't forget about next week's session with Melissa Pratt. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks again, Katelyn.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Night.